Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Washington Hospitality Association's webinar with the Advisor Network. Today we've got Rick Braa and Tom O'Brien, and Rick is the leader of our Advisor Network for the association, and we're here to answer all the questions that you have in relation to your business, and especially these days. So one of the reasons why we're doing these monthly webinars with Rick and other members of the Advisor Network is because we are getting a lot of member questions about everything from buying and selling your restaurant to operational. And today we're going to be focusing on buying and selling your business and your restaurant. And Rick, why don't you go ahead and take it from here?
Great. Thanks, Lex. So as Lex mentioned, there is an awful lot of anxiety in the market today. And there has been a lot of activity around whether to buy or sell restaurants. At the beginning of the crisis, people that were looking to buy restaurants were very interested in buying restaurants. And then that temperature kind of faded to, okay, well, if it's a great deal, maybe I'll think about it, to I'm not interested. So now we've had enough fatigue with the current crisis that the market is really starting to shake up, I believe. So let's start off with the first question, Lex. Tom, thanks for joining us. Tom's an expert in buying and selling restaurants. So Tom, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us a little bit about your background, then we'll get to the questions.
Okay, Tom O'Brien with Pacific Commercial Brokers, been helping people buy and sell restaurants for about 25 years in the Puget Sound area. And can honestly say I haven't seen anything like we're in right now, but the good news is there's still buyers and there's still sellers. It's just there's a few more hurdles to cross right now.
That's right. So the first question that we have is, what does the market look like for selling restaurants right now?
There is a market. The pool of buyers is smaller, and the buyers that are out there are expecting some type of deal. And they're also putting pressure on landlords. So anytime we go to talk about a lease, they're looking for some type of mandatory, in the case of any mandatory shutdown, they want some language in there to protect them so that they don't get have to pay rent if they can't operate their business. So there's some things that most landlords are open to that and putting some type of language in there where we go to a percentage rent or something. But the market is there. Prices are a little depressed, and there's a lot of asset sales. So there's some inventory out there too.
That's great feedback. So one of the questions that I had kind of peeling off of that is, who initiates that conversation with the landlord? That's kind of a tricky thing, because most leases do have a provision that says that the landlord needs to approve the buyer, but such approval would not be unreasonably withheld. So what's the kind of how do you get around that?
Well, with any offer, you have your lease contingency, and what we do is we just go to the landlord and say, we've read the lease. These are the points that we'd like to discuss with you, and this is one of the points we bring up. Now, some landlords don't want to talk about it at all, but at the same time, they don't want their building to go dark with that particular tenant because it's going to sit there a while. So, they can threaten, they have a personal guarantee and all this, but if there's nothing to go after, there's nothing to go after. So most of them are open to working something out. They want to keep the tenant in the space.
Right. You mentioned they don't want that space dark, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this ties into the selling side of things, just kind of the opposite side. You spoke to some of it. So you can kind of breeze through this if you like, but what's the market look like for buying right now? So I'm very interested.
Yeah, there are some opportunities. Guys have closed, and for instance, I can talk freely about it because it's a closed restaurant. Crown Hill Broiler on 15th. Gentleman put $750,000 in it 2 years ago, and he's got this beautiful facility. Someone can pick it up for $75,000. So there are some great deals out there if you've got a concept and an idea, good neighborhood. Rent is reasonable. But there is some opportunity out there for sure for buying.
Are you seeing pressures on rents? As far as when somebody buys, they go in to renegotiate with the landlord. That's been a pretty big question. Are you know, what is the pressure that's being applied on the landlord as far as rents going forward?
Yeah, everyone wants less rent. You know, a lot of these guys have mortgage payments too. So, you know, most landlords are willing to work something out either temporarily or short term to get a deal done. But they aren't, you know, just lowering rent arbitrarily. They want to keep the rent up, and they'll take a step back for a short period of time, and then they want to get back where it's going. I mean, the people that are out buying are optimistic enough that we know that we're going to get through this at some point, whether it's a year from now or 2 years from now or 3 years from now. We're going to get back to some sense of normalcy.
Great. Well, that's terrific news. I think the next question is really interesting from the perspective of, you just mentioned the one restaurant that we put $750,000 in, basically sold it for 10 cents on the dollar, which, you know, obviously, if you could open a restaurant for $75,000 that's already built out, maybe you have to put a little bit of dough into it, but not much. What are valuations really looking like out there? So I've got a restaurant. I put $2 million into it, and it wasn't performing particularly well. And then this hit. What are you seeing as far as valuations around those kind of businesses?
Yeah, if you were performing well before COVID, there's not a lot of hope. I mean, someone might pick up the assets from you at a significantly discounted price, but you know, pricing, the valuations I see, the multiples are being reduced. So there are some businesses performing well in this environment, and they're still, people will pay for it, and they're still getting their dollars. But a lot of people, the COVID and the lack of sales or depressed sales is definitely driving valuations lower.
So those brands you mentioned, some are doing well. Who have you seen that's doing really well? What verticals?
I've seen, we worked on a deal recently where it was 6,000 square foot facility, and with 50% occupancy, he still had the space. He could put 150 people in there, and it's a drinking establishment, and people are going out and drinking and playing pull tabs, and they were doing extraordinarily well, and they got paid for it. I also see takeout concepts doing, as you can imagine, as well as pizza. Pizza's doing real well.
That's not a big surprise. Pizza, and I think Mexican has also done very well during this time. In fact, I had a call recently that before everything kind of started opening back up, that the operator basically asked me the question, do I have to open my restaurant when we're allowed to? And of course the answer is no. You can operate as a ghost kitchen as long as you like. And I think a lot of people have taken locations that weren't working and they've converted them into ghost kitchens, or they've added additional concepts. They've closed the dining room and they're using the dining room as additional staging space for third-party delivery or takeout or delivery on their own. But the whole idea that was emerging before this, because we were oversaturated with restaurants, there was a move to begin to have more sales per square foot, which in some cases required you to kind of retool your business and add another concept in, so you could kind of double your revenue, or hopefully double your revenue, but at least pick up some additional revenue for the space. So these larger spaces, I imagine that we're seeing quite a bit of traffic in the larger spaces, right? So the bigger spaces that seem like an anchor before aren't such a bad thing now, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, exactly right.
So those 6,000, 7,000 square foot restaurants that were struggling, now are kind of sitting in the driver's seat,
Yeah, they're
especially going into winter.
glad they have the space.
Right, great. All right, so question is it better for me to keep my location open and list it for sale or close it?
Well, if you close it, hopefully you can still sell it. I mean, it's a math problem. Each person's situation is different, but if your landlord's not working with you on rent, you're forking out $10,000 or $12,000 a month, can start adding up real quickly. So you got to do the math. I can tell you, it's always, in my opinion, easier to sell something that's at least got some sales coming in the door and is operational. And when your business is closed, they're really gonna the vultures are out. They're going to be out there really pushing, being aggressive on pricing because they know you aren't operating, you have no sales, and you're still responsible for the rent. They could salivate seeing something like that and really be aggressive on going after you on a price point. If you can keep it open, and I would say it's best to do that, but in some instances, it does not make sense to keep it open. So you just got to do the math and see what works for you.
I think that's a great point. The sales cycle in Washington State tends to be, as I've mentioned before, kind of a silhouette of Mount Rainier. So we're up a little bit through the holidays, and then we dive down for the next couple of months, and then we begin that big ascend into summer. Then we come down the other side. The problem that we had this year was that a lot of people live on their vendors through January and February, and then start getting caught up in March, and that's when everything hit. So we've seen people in quite a big hole, much worse than ever, of course, but there were no reserves going into what was to be the busiest time of the year, and then we were closed down there for a period of time, only for takeout, which didn't work particularly well for especially for fine dining or casual dining that built their business around dine in. So right now, I imagine there's a little bit of a feeling of panic with some people. Are you seeing that at all?
Yeah, I am. And the other thing I'm seeing is people are kind of holding out to see if there's going to be another round of PPP money or something similar. And they're just praying that that's going to come through. And if it doesn't, I can just see some cards starting to fall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that likely is, at best case, a month away. At best case, if they're not going to even visit it until after the election, the chances of getting something launched in November are becoming slimmer and slimmer. So are you seeing the phone starting to ring more than you were before?
We're seeing people questioning, what should I do? And it's hard for me to answer and tell them about their business because I don't know all the ins and outs. But people are wondering, should I close? Should I sell? What are my options? We've had a lot of that.
Okay, great.
Hey, Rick.
Yes.
I would like to remind our participants, if they have any questions, feel free to go ahead and type them into the chat or the Q&A down at the bottom of the screen.
Thank you, Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
So the next question is, if I'm closing, how do I value my business for sale?
Well, what I do is places that have patios, people want patios now. You look at the equipment package. If you're gonna close your business, but you're still paying the rent, let's get everything out of there that's broken so that when people walk in, they don't feel like they're buying a bunch of garbage. Unfortunately, we all know used restaurant equipment sells for 10, 25 cents on the dollar. So you're looking at an asset sale and the infrastructure, and location is also important, but you're probably, depending on the build out and the location, it could be 35 to 55, $75,000. It's hard to say like I said, it's different for everybody, but you're going to sell for pennies on the dollar.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Yeah. That's why if you keep it
I
off,
don't see that.
you're better off.
Say that again?
You can keep operating, you're better off because you at least have something flowing through there.
Right, right. And all of that, food and beverage and everything, you can sell that inventory off,
Right.
even at taking a discount if you need to. So let's switch over to the positive side here. The positive side of the equation is I've got people that are very, very interested in buying. So they want to take advantage of the current climate. They see the end is in sight. They've got a little bit of money in the bank. They can, as you mentioned, make a deal with the landlord. So how do I go about finding locations that might be a good fit for my concept?
There's a lot of resources to find locations. You can reach out to us, but there's the Biz Buy Sell, the BizQuest, Business Smart. There's tons of online platforms where people list restaurants for sale, and just driving around, you'll see signs up. But there are some good locations available, and I think there's going to be more coming online. And it's being in the right place at the right time and just keeping your eyes peeled. It's all there's no rocket science to it. It's just paying attention.
So I know that you're a broker and you'll have a bias around this, but do you think that people should use brokers right now if there's a lot of inventory on the market?
I think anyone who can get a deal done that they're happy with should go about it the best they can. If you've never done it before, I would use a broker. There's some things out there that we, second nature to us that we think about that they may not think about. But what I want to do is I want to see spaces filled and economic activity, because as long as everything's running and operating, it's all going to come back full circle. So I want to keep people going. And
Yeah, I agree. I think using a broker is actually pretty wise because, as you mentioned, it's second nature to you. Just listening to you talk, there's a lot of nuance in what you're saying that's just second nature that people aren't going to think about. It also helps, I think, back to one of my questions around, negotiating the lease as well, because the nuances of what the landlords are looking for as well and how to get the deal done. And I think a lot of times if you're not really experienced at doing this, you could end up not getting a great deal during a time that you should be getting a great deal. And I think you have the ability to help people navigate those waters. So what are some of the things that you think people would miss if they were kind of doing it on their own, and why you should use a broker?
In regard to leasing, like I said, I would always suggest to add some type of shutdown language in there. We always try and get, patio space or extra storage space throwing in a lease. We always try and at least bump rent up over time rather than starting at a higher point. We always work with trying to get smaller annual increases, capping the triple net or the pass-through expenses, or when it comes to HVAC maintenance, limiting the amount of exposure that they would have. So we'll limit the tenant to $2,500 a year on HVAC maintenance, and then the landlord will take it beyond that. Capital improvements on HVAC too. HVAC can get expensive for maintaining, so I always try and help people mitigate that cost, which is going to come at some point. Grease trap, grease interceptors. Make sure if that's is required, we can get the landlord to participate in putting those in because it's going to be something that is going to benefit the building in the long run. So we can get some TI money to help do that kind of stuff. Those are just some examples of what we look at.
That's outstanding. I think that is a great summary. That lease negotiation and helping kind of get the deal done for the buyer is a huge value add because you do have a lot of purview to many, many deals. And you can speak when a landlord objects to something, you can say, you know, that this is very common that we look for this kind of thing. So I think some of those comments around HVAC, capping the triple nets, grease interceptors, and some of that can get very, very expensive. It's a lot, you know, it's like buying an old house, right? There's a lot of hidden expenses, and I think that's where you can add a lot of value in the buying side. So the next one is I received TPP money, and my cover period is expired, as many, many people are expiring either this week or they have this month already. I'd say the vast majority of people are just about at the end of their covered period or their alternative covered period. And I think it's going to, we're heading into that slow time of year. So anxiety, as I mentioned, is high. So I received PPP money. Can I sell my business and still have my PPP loan forgiven?
The short answer is absolutely. So what we've seen, and Rick, you can probably elaborate on some of this as well, is that when a business sells and they do have a PPP loan, that the amount of that loan has to be held in escrow, so it can be paid back, or it will be dispersed back to the seller when the loan is forgiven. Is that?
That's right. Yeah. So you essentially are saying that I go to sell my business, I get a deal done. First of all, I have to check with the bank before I can even sell my business because the assets of the business are tied to the loan. So I've got to go to the bank and I've got to discuss this with them. I got to get bank approval. So finally get a bank approval. I call you and say, I'm ready to sell. I sell my business. And what has your experience been with the banks working with big banks, small banks? What's been their response?
Oh, they're happy to let you do whatever you want to do. But again, if you have a $200,000 PPP loan and you sell your business for 75,000, you're not in good shape, right? So the idea is, we did one recently for over $1 million. We had a $400,000 PPP loan. That the $400,000 PPP loan had to be held in escrow and was not dispersed to the seller. Now, once they go through and the loan is forgiven, that money will go back to the seller if it's forgiven. If not, the funds are there to pay the loan back. So
yeah, that's a real pickle.
Yeah. I haven't been in a situation where we've been upside down on that yet, but I'm expecting that they're coming. So most of these loans should be forgiven. I even heard one thing that small loans, they weren't even going to make you apply to be forgiven. So it's such a fluid thing right now. There's no really set rule. They seem to be changing all the time. So, in fact, right now, the PPP loan, they want the funds given back to the bank that made the loan, and banks don't want it. So it's still a little confusing on what's going on.
Yeah, that was something that we talked about before the call. Was not all banks are set up for this, right?
Right.
So being in touch with your banker early on would be very wise because the bank can be a cog in this and slow things down.
Right. And, someone may have, besides a PPP loan, they may have an SBA on top of that. So, they're both SBA products, but, I don't know who would be in first position or second position or how all that would work. But,
right.
We'll run, when you buy a business, you run UCC searches. So we'll see, that the taxes have been paid and what loans are out there so that we can deliver the assets to a buyer free and clear of liens and encumbrances. There are some hurdles sometimes we have to go through if taxes haven't been paid, or there are some outstanding liabilities that will transfer onto the buyer. We gotta avoid that.
Are most of the deals that you're doing asset sales, or are they business sales?
Recently, they've been business sales. We've got a few asset deals that we've done, but the SBA is loaning money. I think the federal government's telling them to loan money, and you've probably heard of EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And they have got a new one with the C on the end. So it's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, and coronavirus. So if your business performed well prior to COVID, that the SBA is loaning money. And it's as long as the business performed and you can meet the debt coverage ratios pre-COVID, and they have some sales and are doing okay. Granted, they aren't doing as well as pre-COVID, but the bank, we're still getting money for people.
That's outstanding. I like that. That EBITDA with the plus C.
Yeah.
Because that's been a real question. How do I value my business? Because before this all happened, it was really good, but I've run out of gas. I've realized for this whole thing, I want to get out. But the restaurant was doing very well before coronavirus hit, and now I'm in a position that I want to sell. So what I hear you saying is that the banks are willing to take a look at those deals pre-crisis.
Yeah, they'll look at pre-crisis and then look at what you have here, and then if your sales are down everywhere, but if you've shown a history and durable sales pre-COVID and they're down, but you still have a decent business, not as good, they know it's going to come back. They're loaning the money.
Great. Awesome. So the second one, a lot like the first one, the second part of the question is I had to close, unfortunately. I've got my PPP, everything is expired now. If I had to close because I just can't make the rent, can my loan be forgiven at that point?
That I believe it can. You may be able to talk more on this, but I believe if they've met the criteria, whether you're open or closed, I think that the loan can be forgiven.
You've got to get that loan application in right away.
Yeah.
Because this is another one thing that we know about PPP is it's been very muddy, and the rules have been really changing along the way. And this one of closing your business because the loans are secured, the assets secure the loan, is a really tricky thing because they don't want you to close your business. They gave you money for that purpose, and if you do close your business, you must make sure that you are ticking and tying all of the details of that loan out so that it's not considered fraudulent. In other words, you took this money, you knew you were going to close, and then you went out and spent it on other things like cars and houses and different things that it was not intended to be, such as rents, utilities, and mortgage interest and payroll. So that ticking and tying is absolutely critical if you've had to close your business, and you've got to get that application in right away. And a lot of banks aren't ready for that. So it's a difficult time. Some people have just said, I just can't afford to stay. I'm out of money. And one of my clients early on asked me the question, Rick, what do you do when the bank account goes to zero and there is no money? There are no pockets. There's no way to get any more. Might I have to close? If that's the case, then what? So carefully tracking your PPP usage is critical. And if you used it for things that weren't forgivable and you're at the point where you haven't used it all, you better make sure that you've got a good account of that and set that money aside or go get it somewhere. So you've got to make sure that you're not going to be accused of fraud through this whole thing, because you did sign an affidavit when you took a PPP loan that you will use the proceeds for payroll, rent, utilities, and mortgage interest.
Absolutely.
I got a follow-up question on the PPP stuff. What if, how, does it work differently with the EIDL? Because I know those loans in particularly are attached to secured assets. So what are the differences between that you need to look for with an EIDL versus looking at getting your PPP forgiven?
That's a great question because the EIDL is not as flexible as the PPP. And it can be really restrictive in how you're to use the proceeds, no double dipping, but it is in first position with those assets. And so there is a conflict. You've got to get permission from the bank to do any kind of sale if you've got an EIDL loan. You have to have, the bank has to, I'm sorry, the SBA, it's not the bank. This is a direct lending from the SBA. You've got to get permission from the SBA for the EIDL because it is a much more restrictive loan than PPP. PPP, they're looking to forgive it. EIDL, they want it repaid. So they're going to want those proceeds. You have an EIDL loan, it's securing the asset. The assets are securing the loan. When you sell your business, you've got to pay that loan off. You got to get SBA approval first, and then you got to pay that loan off. So they're not going to let it sit out there for 30 years. Once those assets are gone, you've got to remit those proceeds over because it's an easy payment. You know, it's $700 for $150,000. It's like $730, $731 a month for 29, 30 years. So you've got to turn the money over once you sell. Pardon?
It's not forgivable.
Right.
So with that then is if so the orders, let's say if you have an acquisition and you're getting some cash out and then you wanted to pay back the EIDL, you still need to get permission from SBA to go through with the sale, even though the sale would in effect pay off the loan.
That's right.
Okay.
You get permission, you sell it, then you pay off the EIDL. The tricky thing here, as Tom has brought up, is setting that money aside. It needs to go into escrow. So you've got to sell it for more than your PPP loan and your EIDL loan combined. So the PPP, because there's no personal guarantee, that's going to be easier to walk away from. But the EIDL is very restrictive, and there's personal guarantees for loans over 200,000, which the earlier loans were much higher than the latter loans. So putting pressure on selling for the right amount goes back to what Tom is talking about. Stay open if you can. You've got to get a premium for your business if you've got an EIDL and you have a PPP.
As a follow-up to that then, so let's say Tom is in the middle of selling a business and the business that is selling has an outstanding balance of, you know, it wouldn't be this low, but let's say $50,000 left of a $150,000 loan. But as you know, with a sale, time is important. It needs to go quickly and smoothly. And getting permission from SBA, that sounds like going through bureaucratic gauntlet. How long would it take for a business owner to get approval if they were in the middle of a sale, because everything is contingent upon that?
Tom, have you dealt with this yet?
I haven't. We just got the ones that we've done. The bank just told us that hold the money back. It was the bank, not the SBA. So that's who told us. So we held the money back. So, I can tell you that in the past where I've sold businesses that had large SBA loans where we didn't have enough funds to cover the loan, they're very negotiable. Otherwise, what you do is you say, all right, if they're your assets, you need to either start paying rent where your assets are sitting or move the assets out of this premises so we can relet it. And they don't want to deal with it. So they'll take a haircut to sell the assets in place.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm still in buying mode. Should I wait to buy a restaurant until the seller has their PPP forgiveness?
I don't think it matters. That's their loan. The fund should be set aside to do it. So as from a buyer's standpoint, there should be zero liability or concern about that.
Okay, great. That's been a pretty good question. What do I do? I want to buy this business. A lot of the PPP loans have a provision from the originating bank that said you have to get bank approval in order to sell. So this goes back to the bank, and setting aside money in escrow can complicate business sales and can slow them down. So make sure, for those that want to sell that have a PPP loan, make sure you check your loan documents, because the bank may have a provision in there. The difference between the EIDL and the PPP, the EIDL is written directly by the SBA. The PPP comes from the bank, originated through the bank. So they have the ability to write their own loan documents. They've got some bumpers that they need to make sure they're inside, but they have the ability to write their own. So one bank may not have a provision at all, another bank might. So make sure that you check as a seller, you've got to check your loan documents before you sell your business, because the bank could veto it. Now, I don't know why they would, but they could, or they could slow it down and keep you from doing that.
And that was the last question on the deck. Are there any questions in the chat?
While we have this little break here, I'd like to put out a special thank you to US Bank for sponsoring this webinar today.
Absolutely. Lisa, were there questions that came through the chat?
Not yet. We're still waiting for those. If you guys want to type in your questions into the chat or in the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen, we can certainly go ahead and answer those on the air.
Great. And I think, there we go. So
Are there?
Differential and multiples pre and post is the question, Tom.
I've seen multiples go down a little bit. We usually would use a 3-time multiple, 2.75 to 3-time multiple, and I see that down 2.5 or even less for non-well located or poorly performing.
Yeah, so they're not even considering that, right?
Pardon?
They're not even considering that. If it's a poor location, they're not even looking at earnings, right?
No. Let's see.
The question is, if I sell some of my stock to long-term employees, are the same rules regarding PPP and EIDL loans still the same?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think there is a percentage, and you can check your EIDL loan for that. I believe it's if you sell more than 20 to 25%, you've got to get permission. So that is, you're basically converting your business over. You want to sell some to your change in ownership has to meet the provisions that are in your loan documents. And those should be spelled out in the SBA loan doc. But information on EIDL is very difficult to get. They're very old, as I mentioned before. They're very old loans, and they didn't rewrite the rules to be more modern and more easy to understand. So there's a lot. This goes back to having to be in touch with the SBA. But the EIDL loan is much more restrictive than PPP is when it comes to this. It'll be an issue if you sell more than a certain percentage, and I believe it's 20% in the EIDL loan document. Great question.
That's it. Tom, if anybody's interested in looking at businesses to acquire or looking at selling their business, how would they go about reaching you?
They can reach out to us typical methods, text, phone, email. Should I Google search? You can do the search
We'll add
specific.
the link. We'll add the link in the description
Okay.
after in the
Great.
replay.
Lex, could they contact the Hospitality Association and ask for Tom's information if they lose it?
Sure. No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. That's a pretty quick way, is just use the Restaurant Association or the Hospitality Association, sorry, and ask for Tom's information. I can tell you, I've worked with Tom for years, and he is a pro. And if there's a deal to be had, he can get it done. So thanks, Tom, for your time. I really appreciate you spending the morning with us today and popping on here.